Soil is the only thing that stands between us and, starvation.
Is
And
that,
so,
yeah, is it for that reason? Because
yeah,
we depend on it for food?
yeah. So it's looking after soil. And all this means that farmers can spend, more organic matter, more legumes, fixing more nitrogen of their own, less phosphorus being washed out of the soil because the soil is more organic matter in it and is more resilient. Means clever farmers, clever farmers who are going down this route are finding they're spending a half or even a third or even a half less on fertilizer than they used to spend.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is all helping to sort of make farming less intensive in a way, and yet not necessarily less profitable. Less in, maybe less out. But in the end, the balance, you know, means that you can still make money.
How does kind of, we were talking about sparing room for like natural habitats to regenerate. How does that play into the farming kind of issue or problem? Is it a good idea to give space on farmland to natural habitats?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Um, Again, farmers are finding that if you have, there was a tendency at one time to regard hedgerows, for example, as totally superfluous, just a waste of space. But what people now realize is that hedgerows are they're good for the soil, they're good for biodiversity, they're good for pest control because all the animals that eat the pests in the crop live in the hedgerow. And if you widen the hedgerow a bit, you have strips of wildflowers by your hedgerows around your fields. Those hedgerows and those wildflower strips are full of they're full of predators. They're full of beetles that come and eat the aphids and the caterpillars in your crop. They're full of pollinators that come and pollinate your crop. And you have a closer approximation to a kind of functioning natural system. Um, and so there's a lot of movement in the recent years down in the direction of travel is is hopeful, I think, in farming. And this is all gradually, gradually lowering the overwhelming sort of fertility of the entire landscape. Of course, there are large chunks of the landscape which have never been farmed, never been fertilized, and that's where most of the biodiversity, especially the floristic biodiversity, still survives. And those areas, we should feel under no compulsion to exploit those areas. We should definitely, if we care about preserving our native wildlife, we should we should leave them alone. Definitely.
So in England is a great, I don't know, I don't want to say solution, but a great potential solution would be to do that, like widen the hedgerows and then just preserve the small fragments of non-agricultural areas that we have left. Or do you think it's a good idea to also expand national parks and let forests regenerate as well? If in an ideal world.
Yeah, probably both of those actually. Um, we've a long tradition of a lot of biodiversity living on farms. I mean, if you go back to if you go back to you know the landscape that Jane Austen would have recognised, where farmland was of necessity less intensive than it is now because there were no chemical fertilizers and it was all done by horses and oxen. Um, Farmland was where a lot of our biodiversity lived, and some of it could again as I say, with hedgerows, with wildflower strips, with just preserving little bits of woodland in corners of fields, with farm ponds coming back. Um, Amazing how many ponds there used to be in Britain. I mean, not just ponds, but frankly, another shifting baseline syndrome is how dry the country is now. People don't realise just how wet the whole country was. I mean, just wet, just swamp, mire, rivers, floodplains. You can kind of see why drying it out was a bit of a priority because you couldn't get anywhere, really. I mean,
Really?
yeah. I mean, before we started draining Britain, it was just wet everywhere. Wet. Um, Bringing any of that back in a small way, um, is is helpful. So yeah, more ponds and on the less, just in less productive corners of fields on farms. It needn't cost anything really, um, and it absolutely didn't cost anything because there's money, there's government money to do these things. Various agri environment schemes pay farmers to do this now. So yeah.
If we were talking about shifting baseline syndrome, right? How have you seen the UK's biodiversity change since you were a little boy to now?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Um, I'm not sure I personally have. And let me explain. Let me explain why I think that. Um, most of our, and most for most of us, our encounters with wildlife, if we have any, are at home, specifically in gardens. And uh, that's not surprising in a way. I mean, that's as a child, that's where you spend your time in your garden. And I don't think I don't think garden biodiversity, and there's a lot of biodiversity in gardens, by the way, far more than people realise.
Do you want to mention do you remember in your book the Leicester suburban garden story?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, this is a something I'm very happy to bang on about at the slightest opportunity, which is of course the legendary Jennifer Owen, um, who should be much better known, the patron saint of wildlife gardening. She spent 30 years recording all the wildlife as far as she could of her perfectly ordinary suburban garden in Leicester. 30 years. And what that revealed was a level of biodiversity that's just astonishing. To me, astonishing. I mean, thousands and thousands of species of insects. Um, in fact, the majority of the stuff she actually caught, she couldn't identify because there were just too many. She was an expert in some areas, but there were just too much stuff for her to identify.
Didn't she discover a few new species of parasitic wasp,
Yeah,
if I remember correctly?
yeah. She looked at parasitoid wasps, which is a group that's very diverse. They're very small, and no one takes much notice of them. And she found half a dozen species that were new to Britain, never recorded before in Britain. And she found 3 or 4 species that were new to science,
Wow.
previously unrecorded, undescribed, just by looking somewhere where no one had ever looked before in a very ordinary garden in Leicester, and I lay emphasis on the description there of very ordinary,
Yeah.
because Jennifer Owen's genius was to ask the right question, which is what lives in an ordinary garden, not a garden where all the stops have been pulled out to try and promote biodiversity, but just a garden that she managed for her own enjoyment, with flowers, fruit, pond, lawn, rockery, etc. Not a garden that you or I would regard as in any way unusual. Absolutely amazing. And so that work was carried out in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, and showed this astonishing level of biodiversity in gardens. And I think that was probably the case in my parents' garden when I was growing up. That I was just amazed as a small child by frogs and toads. I remember finding toads living under the shed, and just being amazed by just simple stuff, by butterflies and bees, and I still am in the same place in my garden now. I go out and I go and look at my pond and I see the newts swimming around, and I see that all the different species of birds on the bird feeder, and it's just, and I think gardens have preserved a lot of biodiversity that would have been lost otherwise from the landscape that most people encounter every day. So that if you're a small child growing up now, I think you have the same opportunity to go out your front door and see the same kind of stuff in, frankly, the same kind of quantities that I used to see when I was, a small child.
I definitely think gardens are probably the front door to loving nature for many people. That was definitely the case for me. Growing up, I became obsessed with birds because of Springwatch, but also because of having them in my garden. Yeah. And my dad was a massive bird nerd as well. He had loads of bird books I used to go through when I was younger. I remember him saying he lived just in front of a railway embankment, which had an orchard the other side of it. And he remembers nightingales nesting at the back of his garden. Yeah. But I guess that's an exception. It wasn't an urban garden. It was a rural one. But
that is an exception. That is an exception. And mostly what the evidence shows is that most of the biodiversity you'll find in a garden is about the same, irrespective of where your garden is. That's not quite true for birds because they're so mobile.
Yeah.
So if you have a rural garden, birds will come into your garden from surrounding countryside that are not urban birds. And so you will see a bigger range of birds in a rural garden. You'd be very lucky to see nightingales, I agree.
Yeah.
But even so, the thing about wildlife is I find just as much fascination in the very common as the rare. There's a bit of an archway out here in the garden, and every morning there's a pair of collared doves that sit on it, looking for all the world like a sort of happily married old couple, and they sit there kind of looking at each other and doing a bit of cooing and having a bit of a peck around, and then they fly off together, and somehow you see them, and every morning they're still there, you're kind of reassured that the world is still functioning as it should do. You know,
Definitely, yeah. Yeah,
in a
yeah, definitely.
in a weird way.
It's comforting, isn't it? I
It's
mean,
yeah,
I have so many stories like that. That's how I began my career as a wildlife photographer, was just
yeah,
observing the birds and wildlife around my garden. I even have a picture of two collared doves on my neighbour's brick wall, like kissing each other, or looks like they
yes,
were kissing. And
exactly.
even down here in Cornwall, we've got herring gulls, the opposite side of my accommodation, and there's a whole story behind it. There's different nests on different
Yeah,
roofs, and there's fights, and then there's the great black back gulls above my building
yeah.
that swoop down, and there's a bunch of conflicts. You don't have to look very far.
You don't have to look very far at all. I mean, I'm not too far from the sea here, and the sky is full of gulls all the time. Um, and quite often, way above all of them is a buzzard. And the first thing you know it's there. You just hear this distant, and you go, oh, there he is, you know. Um, and and we seem to have a lot of jackdaws here,
Hmm.
and I just love jackdaws because you can just tell how clever they are.
Yes, yeah.
They sit there and look at you with their head on one side, you know, like weighing you up, and you could just tell how smart they are, you know. So I, I just I birds birds of course birds are the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, birds they're obvious in a way, although they're not all obvious, but yes. And yet birds, if your garden's got plenty of birds, all is right with the world, frankly, because almost all those birds are brought up when they're young, at least, on invertebrates of various kinds. Aphids, caterpillars, spiders, you name it. And if all that other wildlife that you never noticed wasn't there, the birds wouldn't be there.
So they're probably the best indicator species of
Birds,
biodiversity.
birds are a real indicator. If if the birds look healthy in your garden, then everything else is probably healthy too. Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah. So birds, you know, so gardens. I'm a bit of an evangelist for garden wildlife. I wrote my own little book on garden wildlife years ago, No Nettles Required, um, which I still regard as one of my proudest achievements, basically. And people still come up to me and say how much I loved reading No Nettles Required, you know, and the advice about what to do to attract wildlife. But there isn't much you have to do, frankly. Just garden,
Is
just grow
that
stuff.
Yeah? Is it growing stuff, or is it letting stuff grow itself, like we were talking about forests, or in gardens you have to be a bit more hands on?
Oh, you've got to be a lot more hands on. You've got to be a lot more hands on. Yeah. Jennifer Owen, again, going back to Jennifer Owen in her Leicester garden, she spends quite a lot of time. She wrote two big books on wildlife in her garden. She spends quite a lot of time going on about why is all this stuff in my garden? What's it doing? Why is it here? And the conclusion she came to, is the correct one, I'm sure. And the conclusion is it's because of gardening. Gardening maintains the world in a state of almost supernatural diversity, structural diversity, and floristic diversity. Tropical rainforest has got nothing on the average garden for different species of plants per square meter. Yeah. I mean, there's nowhere like it in any natural environment. And you've got all these different habitats, shrubs, trees, herbaceous border, rockery, pond, lawn, and they're all side by side. So in any natural, that's so unnatural. You know, natural habitats, semi-natural habitats, however interesting they are, they're fairly homogeneous. Over large areas, they're basically the same. Gardens are not like that. Even within an individual garden, you get this fantastic diversity. So that if you're an insect or a spider or a woodlouse or a centipede or whatever, there's so much to choose from. There's so many different species and so many different habitats and niches, and you'd have to go very far to find them. So it's not surprising when you stop and think about it that this huge diversity of invertebrates is able to live in gardens. Not to say, of course, that gardens are in any way a replacement for those semi-natural habitats.
Yeah.
For ancient woodland, for chalk grassland, heathlands, marshes, we need those as well. They have different wildlife in them. Stuff that never lives in gardens. But gardens as a habitat are astonishing. They really are. We're very lucky to have them.
Do you think that's the best practical actions we can take as just individuals if we're living in an urban area, for example, to increase biodiversity?
Oh yeah, definitely. Just garden in a garden with wildlife in mind. Don't necessarily do anything specific, but just grow plenty of stuff. Shrubs, trees, herbaceous plants. Keep the ground covered, not too much bare ground. Although actually bare ground is good for some things. Everything has its use, frankly, in a garden. Even things, and that's what's so marvellous about gardens. There may be 20 million or more private gardens in Britain, and they're all different. You couldn't make it up, really. If you were designing a nature reserve, and someone said you could have 20 million little plots, every one of them different, you'd go, I'll take that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have that. That's brilliant. There plenty of stuff will live there, and it does. So in fact, yeah, try and provide. Yeah, the key is plants, and bigger plants rather than smaller plants, because plants are habitat and plants are food. So the more stuff you have in your garden, the more habitat there is, the more food there is. But don't overdo it, because if your garden was a woodland, it would be very nice, but it wouldn't be a garden. It would be short of flowers, for example, because woodlands are not good for flowers. And if you want lots of pollinators, which you do, you need lots of flowers. You need lots of flowers, you need plenty of sunshine. So you need open habitats, you need woodland, you need a pond. You need just